Welcome to this week's lecture on understanding contemporary environmentalism. Today we're going to address the question of difference and ontology in the realm of environmentalism and how it is being challenged and critiqued by decolonial and anti-racist environmentalism. As we've seen, our experiences and use of nature are subject to significant power relationships which often end up creating vast inequalities. Our use of natural resources is subject to unequal access, and the impacts of that use are distributed unequally as well. We certainly saw this in the context of oil production in the Niger Delta, where the oil that is produced benefits multinational companies, and the impact on the landscape is felt by people within the Delta region, a region that is one of the poorest in Nigeria. And in many of our discussions throughout the class, we've often talked about what is known as climate justice, the movement that tries to get us to see that the vast majority of climate change is caused by wealthy countries, but the impact of climate change will be felt not by those who produced it, but by the developing countries who can't mitigate those impacts. It will also, of course, be felt by marginalized groups the world over, including indigenous people, the working class, and poor. Now, what we've also seen is that these inequalities are often distributed in patterns that are formed around difference that have been given significance in today's world. Race, gender, and class are all what we might call vectors within these inequalities. So many scholars, from environmental justice and climate justice scholars to ecofeminists and indigenous activists, have asserted the importance of paying attention to difference in the context of the environment and its uses and abuses. Now, in this class, we've also seen how this assertion also applies to environmentalism itself, that the environmental movement and different attempts to protect or care for nature themselves help perpetrate or even create these inequalities. This was certainly the case with Bruce Braun's critique of the Save the Rainforest campaign in Clayoquot Sound, and it is certainly the message that Dorcetta Taylor has in the podcast that was assigned for this week. Environmentalism, in these ways, reflects the problems of the social and political world more and more generally. So today we are going to look at 3 ways of understanding and classifying these inequalities and how they arise. The first one we want to look at is the way that overt discrimination and racism plays a part in the practices of the environmental movement. In the podcast, the host asks Dorcetta Taylor about why the environmental movement is having a hard time fixing its relationship to race, and she quickly answers, racism, 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 racism. And what she's pointing to is both the unconscious bias as well as the significant amount of overt racial discrimination that she has felt as a Black woman within the environmental movement and the more broader patterns of racism within the environmental movement. Now, beyond the examples that are given by Taylor in that podcast, we can see this happening in contemporary circles. For example, in 2017, the conservative and pretty clearly racist Ann Coulter wrote an opinion piece suggesting that immigration lay at the heart of U.S. environmental problems. She blamed the Sierra Club for abandoning its anti-immigration stance in the early 2000s, saying that they took money to ignore the real issues. And indeed, the Sierra Club was quite clearly anti-immigrant until the early 2000s, and being anti-immigrant in that way certainly functions as a type of racism. Now, we are also seeing a version of this playing out in the east coast of Canada as Mi'kmaq lobster fishers are being attacked by non-Indigenous people who claim to be worried about the damage of the Indigenous fishery on the survival of the lobsters. This is despite the clear difference in size of the fisheries between Indigenous and non-Indigenous fisheries, and the overwhelming evidence from experts in the scientific literature to say that the Indigenous fishery is not, in fact, a problem for conservation. As Mi'kmaq scholar Mercedes Peters argues, this kind of indifference to the evidence is part of a long line of what she calls deliberate forgetting of the colonial legacies and practices of Canada. Now, importantly here, the rationale is very clearly meant to be about protecting the environment, not about colonial jurisdiction. That is, the arguments put forward by non-Indigenous fishers that are objecting to the Mi'kmaq lobster fishing are done in a way that try to present the environmental damage as more important than the colonial history of Canada. Now, what both of these examples point out is that this isn't simply about race, right? That this isn't simply about a set of concerns about one group or another. It's about control. In fact, at the heart of this is what Sherry Pasternak argues is the question of jurisdiction, over who has authority over what kinds of rules can be made. When we're talking about fishing lobsters, it really isn't about who gets the lobsters. Sure, there might be some in the conflict that think it is, but most would probably say that it's about money. But Pasternak, whose book Grounded Authority looks at the long-standing conflict between the Canadian state and the Algonquins of Barrier Lake over forestry access to their traditional lands, would argue that in reality, the issue of the natural resources that are being contested here comes down to a claim to who can have authority over this land, or, in this case, over this part of the ocean. That is, this conflict is more prominent because at the heart of it is the question of jurisdiction. Thus, when someone loses their job or when a company overfishes the stocks, as has often happened in this region, we don't actually see the same responses. We don't have the same sort of effective, emotional, and indeed violent response. The response we're seeing now is because Mi'kmaq lobster fishers are actually challenging the authority of the state to govern this, and in fact, the state, in many ways, has legitimized the racist emotions that are causing this conflict to escalate. This is to say that racism, especially when it bubbles up in public debate, is almost always a kind of strategic choice. It is deliberate, as Mercedes Peters suggests, even when it comes off as emotional and irrational. The ability to criticize certain individuals for overreacting based on race sort of deflects away from the issue of jurisdiction or actual histories of colonial imposition that are perhaps more accurate and more underlying in these cases. Now, the second dimension of the problem for difference, of difference for the environmental movement, and one that we're seeing a lot of progress on, is the question of representation. And this is indeed what Dorcetta Taylor is talking about in a report on the environmental groups in the United States, about how very few of them have a diverse labor force, although, as she says, they're starting to make some changes. When environmentalists get together, she argues, it really is quite a white room. Now, this plays out in a number of ways. As she points out, it comes to establish a certain image of environmentalism that follows a standard white cookie-cutter image. So she gives the example of knowing which flight is going to the environmental conference because it's surrounded by people in Patagonia vests. That is, this representation and its image is particularly white, and by being particularly white, it sort of reifies and perpetuates that reality. And so it becomes hard to enter into that field without invitation and without a concerted effort to make that change. But we can also see this happening in the problems set out by Giovanni De Ciro and Laura Rigel in the imposition of a certain form of sustainability in the non-white community outside of Temple University. In that example, the experiences of residents was that environmentalism was not only populated by white activists, but it also promoted goals that would benefit white communities more than people of color. They call this green gentrification, in which the solutions promoted by the university and other sustainability promoters often end up pricing out marginalized members of the community. The article suggests that within environmentalism, the unequal representation then leads to these kinds of solutions that are promoted that don't reflect and don't benefit those that are underrepresented within the problem. So what we find here is an inequality that is both symbolic and material. That is, it's symbolic in that it deals with issues of representation and image, but it's also very material in that it has access to resources and economies at the heart of it. So we see this symbolic inequality because the images that we associate with environmentalism have for so long been focused on white actors. We see environmentalists as generally middle-class white folk, and the hiring practices and publicity regimes of environmental organizations were for a long time complicit with this image. But yet this translates into a material inequality because the goals of the environmental organizations often end up reflecting that representation, often end up reflecting that bias, and then end up benefiting middle-class white communities as their primary outcome. Now this leads us into our third way of looking at the problem of difference in environmentalism, which is through the lens of ontology. Ontology is a branch of philosophy that aims to understand how we conceptualize our being. It's about as meta as you can get, in that it's aimed not just at thinking about life, but thinking about how we think about life. So ontology asks us to describe what is in the world around us. What is around us? What's our relation to that world around us? And how have we come to conceptualize it? Now this seems like an easy task at first, but when we start to think about it, there are a number of different ways to understand what is in the world around us. As Nicole Wilson and Jody Inkster argue in their article that we read for this week, when we ask about something seemingly simple as water, we start to see that there's a lot more at stake in what is there than we assumed at first glance. So they start to really ask us to think about what is our relationship to water. Modern water, as they point out, is often thought of as an instrumental object. Water is water. We can describe its chemical makeup as H2O, and we know that wherever water is, we will find that same chemical pattern. But, as some have argued, this way of thinking about water really takes a lot out of what water actually is to people. So is a swimming pool the same as a freshwater lake? Is a glacier the same as an ice cube in your drink? We know instinctively that there are differences between these, but we're hard-pressed ontologically to describe them. Even describing the chemical compositions, the different amount of chlorine or other items in that water, don't really get at what actually changes, what are the differences to our experience of those waters. What is so special about that lake? What part of its being is it that matters to that feeling of swimming in it or of being next to it? So for these scholars, they're asking us to start to think more broadly about the ways that we understand what is there in the world around us. For the Karkrush-Tagish First Nations that Wilson and Inkster work with, water is a part of their larger kinship relationships. This means that they actually have a way of describing the importance of a river or of a lake in comparison to a swimming pool or an ice cube. And with this kinship relationship, they can start to articulate more clearly what is at stake in each different landscape and how that landscape matters to us as a culture and as individuals. Yet, this quality of water is hard to recognize in modern water management systems, even within the environmental protections that are set out and advocated for by environmental groups. Thus, for these authors, they are asking us to engage in ontological pluralism as much as we need to engage in the diversity of representation. That is, we need to have a diversity of ways of thinking about the world around us as much as we need to have a diversity of people working on our issues with us. And this is indeed the challenge of Indigenous and decolonial environmentalism. They're suggesting that there is an ontological background to the symbolic and materials inequalities that we see, and any attempts to address those symbolic and material inequalities needs to take into account the ontological questions that they raise. Now, in our discussion on Tuesday, we'll talk about how these different layers can be seen in contemporary environmentalism, and we're also going to try to talk about the strategies that are promoted in these articles and how they might be able to apply to contemporary environmentalism that aren't covered by these articles.